Hello and welcome to BookBeat, the place for all things literary. My name is Sue Ellen Zagrabelny. I will be your host. We have as our guest Craig Reiners. He writes under the name of C.R. Reiners, and the book we're discussing today is the newest book that he has out, and it's the third book of a trilogy, Cascading Lies. Welcome, Craig.
Sue Ellen, thanks again for having me for a third time.
It's a pleasure. It's indeed a pleasure. Let's get down to business right away on Cascading Lies. As I mentioned, Cascading Lies is the third book of a trilogy. Your first book found the main characters as young adults. Can you take us through a bit of the adventure these two experienced going through the three books?
Sure. Well, the first book, Justified Deception, is an international thriller surrounding a young woman who is her mother has passed away. Her father, who was a rising political star, was brutally murdered by his associates, and she's left alone to make do as a prostitute in Nanjing, China. Within the backdrop of the story is a manipulation of global monetary markets, which just adds to the intrigue.
Oh, that's fascinating. What about the next book? Tell us a little bit about where she and now some of the other characters come in.
The characters are just a little older in the second book, Lingering Deception. Here, international monetary markets are still in a free fall, but we now have a monster preying upon unsuspecting. Alex Cutter's security team is called in both to manage the monetary crisis on a global scale and also to address this global monster that's preying upon women.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit about Cascading Lies and where Alex and Sparrow are at that point?
Sure. Thanks, Sue Ellen. Well, Cascading Lies is the final book of the trilogy. In this case, we have a hooded vigilante that captivates the public domain as a hero, but he's anything but a hero. We still have the issue of the cascade, the eroding monetary markets in the background, and also the protective net that Alex and Sparrow have put around their core clientele has been compromised in some way. So there's an issue there. There's also an issue with the Chinese underworld taking revenge, and they're working on understanding what's happened with some manipulation not only in the markets but some massacres that take place on a global scale, and the book really is focused on deceit and redemption.
Ah, the old redemption card. You talked a little bit about Sparrow and Alex Cutter. Can you talk a little bit more about how these characters from Justified Deception and Lingering Deception move forward, and maybe say a little bit more about the time frame?
Sure. Well, in this case, in the third book, Cascading Lies, both Sparrow and her husband, Alex Cutter, are in their late 50s. Their one daughter, Alexia, and her husband are taking much more of a formal leadership role in the international security company they run. And there's still the problem of this global financial crisis that's in the backdrop of the book. And in addition, we have a new hooded vigilante that is at one point looked upon by the public as a hero, but he's anything but a hero.
Okay. As a follow-up question, what went into naming your characters? I'm thinking of the way you identify characters by a particular character trait rather than revealing the name initially.
Well, yes. First off, the naming the various characters was very time-consuming. I went through a whole litany of potential names. One example, there's a Russian oligarch by the name of Gorin Damajan that is rising through the ranks of the Russian mafia. And particularly when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1991, to become one of these 100 or 100 plus oligarchs that really run the country today. I thought he was an interesting character, an interesting name. We also have a beautiful, talented ex-Mossad Israeli agent called Candy Medford that has an interesting past that weaves into the story as well. And then we have a obese mathematical wizard called Jerry Primrose that has a major part of the story as well.
Okay. What about the revealing the names gradually? I'm thinking of a couple of characters in this book where that was the case. You got the characteristic of the
First,
person,
yeah.
but you didn't get the name.
Yeah, I did that by design. I wanted the reader to, in his or her own mind, first of all, picture the character, and also not just their physical characteristics, but also their mannerisms and pick up on their mannerisms. So, for example, Jerry Primrose has got an incredible, sharp mathematical mind, but his physical appearance is anything but menacing. And there is menacing thoughts behind the man, as the reader will discover.
Okay. Can you talk about place, please? Is it similar to the other two books? And how does place contribute to the plot's advancement? Now, I'm asking you 3 questions at once, so take them in any order you wish.
Sure. Well, the first 2 books, Justified Deception and Lingering Deception, take place on a global platform. There's quite a bit done across Asia, not just China, but across Asia. There's an important part that takes place in South Africa. There's an important part that takes place in Western Europe, and for that matter, in Canada. In my business life, I traveled to all those locations rather frequently, and wanted to bring a sense of those places to the book. In Cascading Lies, there are similar international geographies that I've used, but I've used in addition the desert of Nambia in Western Africa as a very unique, exotic location for some trouble.
Okay. It seems like there's a lot of trouble.
There's a lot of trouble.
Okay. Can you talk about any new characters introduced in Cascading Lies?
Yes, there's the audience is introduced to a new character almost on page 1, someone that appears to the public as a crusading vigilante that they should admire. And certainly the public begins to admire this vigilante until something terribly wrong takes place. And some of the public wants to believe that that's not him, but the fact that he's gone rogue, if you will, adds to the intrigue of that particular character.
A rogue going rogue.
A rogue going rogue.
How does the colorful palette of locations that you just talked about a minute ago expand the possibility for story?
Sure. Well, one of the intents was to take the reader on a journey, an exotic journey, if you will, so that we, when you're in southern Germany, south of Munich, at a medieval castle that's run by a brilliant madman, if you will, and that has actual ancient crusade shields on his walls, and acts as a baron of sorts, gives that type of character a kind of a richness, I think, that the the reader likes. I think the other characters, such as the Russian oligarch, the way he lives and how he perceives the world as he gains incredible wealth and power, adds kind of to that international intrigue as well.
The sense of place and the colorful palettes that expand the story, as you were mentioning. What was your inspiration? You talked about your business life. Other inspirations?
Well, certainly my business travel had a lot to do with it. I was, in my business life, able to go to what some people would consider exotic locations, whether it be in the former Soviet Union or Cape Town and Johannesburg, South Africa, or little villages outside of Beijing. And I think that those places, it's not just the places, but what you feel in those places. So I don't belabor the issue, but I want to add things like, what's the smells of the area? What are the tastes of the area? Is it polluted? What are some of the fares that people will order at restaurants? What's the feel of the city or the place that we're in? I did that with firsthand knowledge of all those places, with the exception of the desert of Namibia, South Africa.
Okay. Would you talk a little bit about point of view in Cascading Lies? And my main question is, how did you get the women characters right?
That's an excellent question, Sue Ellen. The dialogue that I write in the books is, without question, the most difficult thing for me to do, to get it right, to get it real. In that case, to answer your question, I typically will run a draft chapter or draft piece of a chapter past several women, my wife Mary included, but there are a number of women that are great readers. Actually, they run book clubs and so on, and so they give me a lot of honest feedback, and I think as a writer you have to certainly take that. I would say 99% of what I get as feedback I use, particularly when it comes to female dialogue and so on. I'd also add, also the most difficult is the real dialogue between a man and a woman, particularly of different ages. When you have to do that and it becomes real, it can be a very short conversation, if you will, maybe with an incredibly minor character of the opposite sex or something. But to make that real takes a lot more time than people believe. But you really feel good when you get it right.
Oh, that's fabulous. The thing that I noticed is, as you went from chapter to chapter, looking through the activity in the chapter through a different person's eyes. How does that transpire, and how does that evolve for you as a writer?
Well, that's really a good question. What I don't want to do, and I did not want to do, is write the book from a outsider author, looking at events. I wanted to take a number of the actions from a character's point of view. And when I started doing that, I think that adds to the richness of some of these characters. Why do they act the way they do? And I think that was, for me, a learning experience. And by doing the third book, it gave me the palette, if you will, to explore that a little more, including the bad actors. In terms of, I wanted to look at what in their history made them the way they were. And there's some legitimate reasons for that. Doesn't make them good characters or that someone you want to be cheering for, but nonetheless, it at least explains why they are the way they are. And that was more interesting. And when you had a third book to get into more of that detail, it gave a little more richness, a little more depth to some of these even minor characters.
Craig, you talked a little bit about dialogue before. Can you say anything more about what role dialogue serves in Cascading Lies?
Well, first off, as I mentioned before, I think writing the dialogue takes the longest time to do it properly. Many times when I'm having a conversation between characters, particularly a female and a male character, I really pause and think through the other person's eyes, what they're hearing and what they're saying, to make that a real give and take conversation. I really enjoy dialogue from a couple senses. One, you get a sense of time and sleepiness and so on. If you've got two characters on an international flight having a conversation, which is going to be very different than two lovers having a conversation, very different than having two diabolical characters that really are working together but also very leery of one another. So that's another point of view, if you will, on how they converse. It's one thing to have the main characters have this dialogue as you go through the story. It's another issue to have the minor characters talk amongst themselves, which I think adds another dimension to the richness of their characters.
I was very taken with the vigilante and how he was revealed through his dialogue with other, as you say, minor characters. Say a little bit more about what that does for the story.
Well, the vigilante, without giving too much away,
yes,
was a very minor character in book 2, and but he moves forward and is in his own mind a rather powerful individual that is in his own mind he's youthful, he's virile, he's powerful, and with this handgun that he carries, he tries to make things right in a world gone horribly wrong. Having said that, he does not always make the best choices and makes one catastrophic choice when he is involved with the murder of children and passerbys that should never have happened.
Oh my goodness. As an author, do you desire to tie everything up neatly in a bow at the end of a story, or is that just an or that we can't answer?
Well, it's a good question, and I think this is the Cascading Lies is the conclusion of what I call this initial trilogy of justified deception and lingering deception. It by design wraps up many of the major characters. It brings conclusion, for example, to the global financial crisis. That's not a giveaway. That's something that they've been working on. But at the very conclusion, as most of these major items are wrapped up, tidied up, if you will, there are, just like in real life, there are some open issues, even maybe a very minor character introduced at towards the end of the book, where I would want the reader perhaps he or she to say, well, I wonder whatever happened to that individual character. So yes, the answer to your question, there's two things I'm trying to do. One is, for the most part, wrap up the major storylines of the 3 books in this final one. I think that's done. It does perhaps tease the reader of what could come next with these characters, both the major characters and the minor characters.
Well, I certainly am looking forward to that. Moving from the substance of the book that we've been talking about, can you talk a little bit about the how-to to make 3 successful thrillers? What went into that?
Having a 3rd book allowed me to do a couple things. It allowed me to give the reader more substantive background on who these characters were, including some of the minor characters, and give the reader a sense of why these characters made some of the choices that they did, and took some of the actions they did. Does not justify some of the actions by any means, but it gives the reader an idea of a little more richer idea of why they made the choices they did.
Was creating this third novel similar or different from creating the first two?
Well, I think, as I said, having a little more time, I was able to sculpt the differences between these characters, and really, in the reader's mind, they have a real good sense of who these characters are and why they are the way they are. I'll add that even our major characters, even the good guys, if you will, are not perfect by any means. In every case, all the characters have some flaws. Some are fatal flaws, some are just character flaws. But there's not a single character in the book, including minor characters, that is either all bad or all good. There's certain characteristics of each character that I hope that the reader will actually wince a little bit, like, gosh, I wish they wouldn't have done that, or I wish they wouldn't have said that, or because that's the way the real world is. And in the real world, people aren't perfect. They aren't all heroes or heroines, and they're all not nasty people either. So even like the nasty people, the vigilante that we talked about earlier in our conversation is not entirely bad either, even though his background, even as a child, was troubled, and he's done some really good things. He's also still a very bad actor at the end of the day.
Yes. A lot of gray areas.
Gray areas, good way of putting it, yes.
A lot of gray areas. Were the mechanics of writing this third novel different from writing the first two?
A little different. When the first book took almost 10 years to write, because I was working full time. I was in Asia, and basically I would write that after my workday was totally through, or returning back from Asia to the United States. So that book was almost all handwritten in airplanes, literally with a stack of paper like this. So that took a long time. Since I retired, virtually all of the writing is done on my PC, usually at the library, not always, but usually at the library. However, I will get up in the middle of the night and jot down notes when something occurs to me, and then handwritten notes, and then transfer them to the computer the next morning.
Oh my goodness.
Because I'm really living with these characters. And not all the characters, but some of these characters, particularly that are in all three books, in my heart of hearts, I really believe they're flesh and blood. I've spent so much time with them that I can sense them, I can see them in my mind's eye, and so on. And so I think that's when it becomes real, and that's when the dialogue becomes real. Even the good characters, as I said, not only have some flaws, but will say some things, maybe to their partner, to their spouse, to another character in the storyline, that you might take exception to. But when you think about it, from their point of view, they certainly might say that.
Storyline. That leads me to something else. How do you keep all those strands of the story straight?
Well, I take a lot of side notes. I do think that in this third book, Cascading Lies, I think the storylines aren't as complex as they were in the first two books, but I also have to take some side notes, particularly on time frames. If such and such happened, are the time frames correct? The people editing my book have been great at that, because they catch things that even I don't as the writer. But yeah, particularly as I had a lot of characters, and they kind of narrow down as you get to book 3. many of the rich characters that, let's say, are not killed off, certainly have the ability to resurface somewhere else down the line, because they're interesting, rich characters that the reader's taken some ownership in terms of whether it's their family background or their military background or their background in banking or trading or what have you. So it's interesting, but I think it's it's something that it evolves over time.
Mm-hmm. I recall in the second book, Lingering Deception, when Alexia was really introduced as a real character. She was mentioned in the first book,
Right.
but she was an adult in the second book.
Correct.
It was like, oh my goodness, she's in the middle of this stuff,
Yeah.
and you have no doubt about it.
Well, and she is. She also comes with some flaws, but she's an incredibly talented, beautiful, and very smart woman. She's the one that, without giving too much away, leads a lot of the charge out of difficult circumstances. Let's put it that way.
Yes, let's not give away too much. Getting back to mechanics of writing, you talked about writing on a PC rather than handwriting. And you do write every day?
Yes. I found to get this done, you have to, first of all, you have to love it, which I do. Secondly, you have to treat it kind of like a job. It can't be just a sidelight. So to get this done, I would typically go to one of the local libraries and work 4 to 6 hours on the book, at least 5 or 6 days a week, kind of as a job, if you will. And that now that doesn't mean, I want to be clear, that doesn't mean that I have great visions of artistic, what's the word? Artistic flair that I've just thought of, or an interesting twist, but because that only happens every so often, that you get those great ideas. But it's writing, it's rewriting. There's a lot of things about writing a novel that are not sexy. It's just a matter of dig and shovel and pick and shovel and work on that, and that's just the work part. But I spend a good deal of time and actually carve out time, just as if you're going to a job, and go somewhere from 10 till 3 or something, and just concentrate on the book. That doesn't mean that if you have a great idea in the middle of the night, you don't write it down. You certainly do, but it's that, and then taking those pieces and running by my wife Mary, or running by this English professor, or running them by some of these women that run book clubs and so on, and not the whole book, just a chapter or a new character develop, and say, does this make sense? And get a third person's viewpoint. And all the people I use are, arguably smart and critical, and they have no problem telling me if what I have on paper is worth it. And I'm sure every writer's like this. There's a lot of things that you'll write and you think, boy, I think I've got it today. And even you look at it later and say,
not so much.
Not so good, not so much. I think you asked me one other time, do I actually throw it away? And I really don't. I literally kind of park that and maybe print it off and put it somewhere else, maybe for another idea or another character development or something. So I don't literally toss it away, but you also have to recognize, this doesn't flow with the book, or it's not necessary with the book. So it's just a process of learning that, but it's also the process of having the discipline to do it every day. Even on days where, I've gone to the library on a Wednesday morning and I'm driving, I have nothing new. I honestly have nothing new.
That's what I was going to ask you, is what happens when the well's dry?
Well, it happens more often than not. So when the well's dry, what I do is I reread what I've written, and does it make sense to me? Also, I found reading something out loud, like to my spouse or to Rick Bozak, the cover guy, artist, that helps too. That helps a lot. It's funny how reading something out loud is different than just reading it yourself. First of all, you can't skip it over anything.
Yes, absolutely.
So
it makes a great deal of difference.
I found that was very helpful to answer your question in terms of what I do when there's nothing. The other thing I spend a fair amount of time on, maybe all authors do, I don't know, but I spend a lot of time on the first and last sentence of every chapter. First off, I want to just hit the reader with something, and then at the end of that chapter, I want almost to force them to turn the page.
Okay. So, if you're there when the well runs dry, and you reread things and read things out loud, where else do you go for ideas?
Well, I certainly don't steal ideas from other books. I mean, I read a lot as well, but I kind of like this to be kind of my own style and get better over time as I write. But to answer your question, what I think I do is try to put myself into that character that I've developed, and how would he or she react to these circumstances they're in. So it's not just good versus bad, or excellent versus evil or something. It's really along the lines of given their background, why are they reacting to the circumstances that I put them in, and does that make sense? And when the writing gets good, and when the dialogue gets better, is when you really have a sense for, as the writer, you are that character for a few minutes. You really are that woman in distress, or you really are that killer. Again, that doesn't happen all the time. It happens seldom. But when it happens, you write like crazy, and you write and write and write, and you don't worry about grammar, you don't worry about spelling, you don't worry about paragraphs. You just write, and then because you can always clean up later. And those little spurts, and I want to be clear, those do not happen all the time. But when they happen, get it down on paper. That's what I'd recommend to new writers. Just get it down on paper, or on the screen, if you will, and then work on it later. Don't worry about anything but getting it on paper.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect.
No. It almost, in my sense, never is perfect, first off. Secondly, I think of all these books I've had published, the only chapter that I have not rewritten a number of times is the final chapter of Cascading Lies.
Interesting. Very interesting. And you mentioned that you have people read your work in progress. Can you talk a little bit about the backgrounds of those people?
Sure. One that we mentioned earlier, Rick Bozak, who's the illustrator of the covers and the back covers, is not only an artist but an avid reader and loves international fictional stories like this, and so he's been a help. But again, he's more of a peer group person. I rely very much on my wife Mary, who's an avid reader, get her opinions. But I also have a number of colleagues that are non-relatives, really not really close friends even, but are very interested in literature. One's a retired English professor from the University of Wisconsin that will literally read a chapter and come back with 2 or 3 typewritten pages of things for my consideration, so you can tell how serious he takes his role. I have a couple of women that run their own independent book clubs and so on, that read all sorts of books. They have been very helpful and very critical, I might add, which is also very helpful. I think as a writer you have to realize that you may have some good ideas, but you don't know the truth. And just because it sounds good to you, or you're kind of proud of that last paragraph or something, doesn't mean it resonates with the reader. And so listening to all these various people have been really helpful. I cannot thank them enough to take the time, not only the time to read it, but to honestly critique it. It's been a huge help.
That makes a lot of sense, because sometimes you can get blind to your own work.
Yes, absolutely can. Yep. You think you know the truth, and you really don't.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about Rick Bozak several times.
Yeah.
You mentioned him.
Right.
How did you meet him?
Well, it's incredible. Rick Bozak and I were lifeguards back in the day when we were in high school and early college years. And he was actually in my wedding 42 years ago. Actually, a close friend back then. But then, as our careers changed, and I moved out of the state and was gone for many years as well. I mentioned the time in China as well. Mm-hmm. And Rick and I just never saw each other, and so it was almost miraculous that we could come together as I was finishing the first book, Justified Deception, and reconnect with him, not only as a reader, but the idea that he would have interest in professionally being the graphic designer of these covers is incredible to me. I will say he won't accept a dime. He just wants royalties when it becomes a movie.
Ah, there's more than one way to make some money out of this.
Right.
Which is part of it too.
Sure.
Which is part of it too. Talk about your publisher. Would you take that down? I just scratched my nose. It looks really weird. Give me 5.
No problem. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Talk about your publisher, please.
Sure. Well, Amazon is the publisher. They have when I first started the process, they had a division called Create Space that I worked with. That's now morphed into another title, Kindle Publishing, which is part of Amazon. And so I work with their editors and their people in the process, particularly as we've been successful with the first 2 books. And they're very helpful and give great assistance to the whole process, the whole publishing process, editing process, and so on. So they've been a big help and a big promoter. Of course, if the book sells, they make money and they give you more attention.
Yeah. Do you job out your copy editing, proofreading, other components of the process, or does your association with Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon does most of it, but a big help also was this English professor that I mentioned. He would often look at the book more from a technical standpoint than from a readership standpoint. So that was he's been helpful on that. And I've had other folks like that, give the time and attention to that. But really, Amazon, at the end of the day, Amazon is the editor.
Do you go to any writers groups, or is the writing for you a solitary profession?
Well, Sue Ellen, I wish I could answer that question by saying that I go drink coffee late into the night in some damp basement with a bunch of writers that we share all our ideas, and that's just not the case.
Okay.
That's not the case. I find that it's most helpful for me anyway. To do the initial writing in a very solitary way, because for me it has to be almost a motion picture that takes place in your head, and then try to draft that, and then use all these ancillary people that I talked about to add or detract from that initial burst of energy, if you will. So no, I think it's from my standpoint, it's it's kind of a solitary act until you are open enough to share it with these others and accept their critique.
That's a real key, because our writing is our baby.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
to have anyone suggest taking words out or taking an idea out,
That's true.
it's pretty hard.
It is tough. It is tough. All the people I've mentioned forthwith are all people I respect, but you're exactly right. There are times when they have these ideas and you have to question them, but then when maybe 2 or 3 of them have the same idea, you have to say, well, I better accept that and realize that I don't always know the truth.
Well, you've mentioned that before, is that the writer doesn't always know the truth.
Right.
And sometimes the reader doesn't always know the truth.
Sometimes it's hard to accept that. It's hard to accept that, particularly if you're really vetted to an idea. For example, you mentioned on the back cover of Cascading Lies is a photograph of a vigilante in a hooded sweatshirt, which I took initially I didn't like, and actually didn't like it a lot. And Rick Bozak suggested it. I actually went out independently to 50 readers of different age groups, different sex, and asked their opinion of that. And 49 of the 50 liked it, so we kept it in. But
and I liked it very much.
You're 50 of 51 then. So I think it's a matter of taking that, also taking critique. There's another neighbor that is an avid reader that has bought all the books, and she will also say, I like such and such, but, and you have to listen to that, because sometimes you get too close to the work. It's so easy to get too close to the work, or feel like your flash of brilliance is first time that's ever been on a piece of paper, and recognize no, there's either way to clean that up, make it clear, or maybe just toss it aside.
And put it on the back burner that it might come forward
Hopefully.
at another time.
Correct.
Okay, we're reaching the end of our time. Is there anything else you'd like to add about the book, about writing?
Sure. Well, first off, Sue Ellen, I can't thank you enough. This is the 3rd time we've been able to do this together. First with Justified Deception, then Lingering Deception, and now with Cascading Lies. And I certainly appreciate your critique as well as the opportunity to be on television with you. And your advice and counsel, not only on camera but off camera, is very much appreciated. And this has certainly leveraged my exposure in the literary world, and I can't thank you enough for that. I'm very pleased that we've developed this rapport together, and that you've found some enjoyment in these fictional works.
Well, I'm looking forward to book 4.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Craig Reiners, for joining me today. And thank you, audience, for joining me at BookBeat, the place for all things literary. We look forward to seeing you next time.